Who was the most susceptible to gaining his work ethic would be, at least on paper, Ambrose Burnside. But in fact, they had misjudged. Ambrose Burnside was his own man. And he was no sycophant. He understood the limitations of George McClellan and went out of his way not to be him. As soon as he got the approval of the president, he was marching within 24 hours. Quick, decisive, aggressive, impressive. 2 days later, he showed up at Fredericksburg and saw the scene that you're seeing from the northern bank of the Rappahannock in Stafford County, looking over at the city. 100,000 plus Union soldiers marshaled there on November 17th. There weren't 1,000 Confederates anywhere near Fredericksburg at that point. Robert E. Lee had been faded out of position and was 2 days' march behind. There was nothing he could do to stop the Federal Army from seizing the inside track and pointing directly towards Richmond. In fact, Robert E. Lee conceded it up front. He didn't even attempt to defend Fredericksburg. He ordered the Army of Northern Virginia to fall back to the next defensible river to the south, the North Anna, and there he'd make his stand. But in mid-stride, he got the intelligence that the Union Army didn't cross the river, and then he backtracked to Fredericksburg. The Union Army was ahead in the timeline. They had the initiative, they had the objective, or at least their first objective, right there in their sights. But the kicker was the Rappahannock River. It's only about 400 feet wide. It's not very deep. There are numerous fords on it. There are even a number of acceptable military fords on it. But this is November and December, when the weather is unpredictable. Winter campaigning is anathema to the 19th century armies. Even if you can get across the river today, you cannot guarantee that it will stay in its banks tomorrow. You cannot guarantee that the road networks that go to and from these fords can handle an army on the march. They have to stick close to the major operational centers, the city, the railroad. They needed pontoon bridges. Burnside ordered them, McClellan ordered them, both with the caveat that they needed to be there when they arrived. And in both cases, there were no pontoons. The pontoons, one of the great bureaucratic snafus of the campaign, were sitting up here in Washington, and nobody had ordered them down to the Army of the Potomac. More important than that, the engineers weren't sent down to the Army of the Potomac, not only to manage bridges, but to establish a base. That's a double-edged sword. The positive, or the negative side, I should say, is obvious. That the Union Army was stuck on the wrong side of the bank. They lost the timetable. It gave Robert E. Lee a chance to react and come back. When Burnside gets on this side of the river, he's got only 1,000 Confederates in front of him. But when the pontoon bridges arrive, there are 78,000 Confederates in front of him. That changes everything. That is not the operation conceived by Ambrose Burnside. He never intended to fight for Fredericksburg. He intended a decisive action to be much closer to the Confederate capital because of the lateness of the year and the difficulty of winter campaigning. You can't afford to have this thing stretched out. It needs to have a decisive moment quickly and overwhelming. If you're going to start right at the banks of the Rappahannock, you got 50 miles to fight back towards Richmond. It's going to take time. There's too many defensible positions, and the weather is too unpredictable. So now you're not only fighting against the Confederate Army, you're fighting against the elements. And that's what he objects to. The positive side, if there's a positive side, is why Robert E. Lee was faded out of position in the first place. As soon as the Union Army disengaged from him upstream, he didn't know where they were going precisely. But the very first thing he did say is, with those 1,000 Confederates in Fredericksburg, is run to the end of the RF&P Railroad, where it links with the Potomac River, and tell me if they're building a base. If there's a base, we know exactly their line of operation. But because the engineers weren't sent, there's no pontoons, there's no base. And that's when Lee decides they can't possibly operate against Fredericksburg. They have no logistics. So that's why it's a huge surprise to him. Had the Burnside's plan been fulfilled, had he had engineers, had he had pontoons, he would have also had a base, and he would have also tipped Robert E. Lee's hand. And so, double-edged sword. The important thing to recognize at this point is that the operational leader, Ambrose Burnside, says the campaign's over right now. The commander-in-chief, taking the more strategic view, says it's not. Abraham Lincoln insists that this must go forward at any cost. Ambrose Burnside will try to talk around the subject to ease him out of it. He'll say things like, I can't promise success as I once did when I thought all the parts of the program would be fulfilled. Read into that the pontoons. To which the president will respond equally obtusely, you have pontoons now, which means the operation continues. Why is there such a political imperative for Lincoln to not only force Burnside to act on the Rappahannock against his own wishes, but also keep in mind that every principal army of the Union is moving forward this winter simultaneously? Ulysses S. Grant is making his first bid to capture Vicksburg. William Tecumseh Sherman is coming at it from the other side of the Mississippi with the option of coordinating or cooperating as they close in. William Stark Rosecrans is moving through central Tennessee, moving out of Nashville against Confederate forces under Braxton Bragg at Murfreesboro. All these campaigns are going to reach their high water mark within 20 days of each other. And yet, 19th century armies hate winter campaigning. Yet we're going to have every single army moving forward in a winter campaign. When have we ever seen all field armies moving forward simultaneously in this Civil War? Up to this point, we haven't. Each one is functioning in and of its own vacuum. It sets its own agenda, its own timetable, without any relevance to or communication with the others. Now we're all on the same page, and the only person who's pulling those strings is Lincoln. So why now? Because September 22nd, we issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The preliminary is an ultimatum to the South, saying that if they renounce secession and come back into the Union before January 1st, we will discuss our problems within the framework of the government. If they don't come back by New Year's Day, we're signing the Emancipation into law, and we're changing everything. It is the most revolutionary document of this entire generation, perhaps this entire century. Because up to this point, the objective has been to restore the Union, to go back to the status quo antebellum. But if you sign the Emancipation Proclamation, you utterly destroy the status quo antebellum. You blow it up, which means that regardless of the outcome of this war, you can never go back to where you came from. You can't restore anything. You can only go forward into a different type of America. As far as Lincoln is concerned, he doesn't want to fight for the Union anymore. The Union was flawed, and it has cost thousands of lives. He wants to fight for an America worth fighting for, which means changing it fundamentally. And this is a radical step. This is the most revolutionary thing that comes out of this. But if it's going to survive, if it's going to thrive, if it's going to be legitimate and have teeth, it's going to rely exclusively on military victory. It has to be signed on January 1st from a position of strength. It becomes even more imperative that fall because 1862 is an off-year election year. The Republicans had spent the better part of the year reassuring voters that all is going well, everything is fine with the war effort, no need to worry or panic. And then in the fall, Robert E. Lee crossed the Potomac into Maryland. Braxton Bragg and E. Kirby Smith crossed into Kentucky. Sterling Price and Earl Van Dorn were striking at Corinth, Mississippi, a grand offensive of the Confederates. And all of them were rebuffed. Lee falls back into Virginia, Bragg back into Tennessee. But the voter confidence is badly shaken. How could this be going according to plan if the Confederates are on the offensive? The best way to reassure them is to gain military victory before the election. Well, the election came and went without any military operation, and the Republicans got trounced. They lost about 30 seats in the Congress. They lost two key gubernatorial elections in New York and New Jersey. Now, 30 seats doesn't seem big today, but keep in mind that 1862, only half the Congress is sitting, because the other half have seceded. And that would be equivalent to losing about 80 to 90 seats today. So this was big, this was decisive, and you have a Congress, it's a hostile Congress, that feels that it has been seated with a mandate to change the way the war is being prosecuted at exactly the moment you're about to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. The only way you can silence your critics and save the emancipation is with military victory. So he insists that they have to go forward. If you're looking at this from Ambrose Burnside's standpoint, if he crosses the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg, he has a minuscule chance of success and an overwhelming chance of defeat. But if you're looking at this through Lincoln's eyes, you cross the Rappahannock River, you have a minuscule chance of success. But if you stop and go into winter camp right now, that is a 100% guaranteed failure. And so the most important thing about Fredericksburg is that the political consideration overrides the military reality of it. It's Lincoln who chooses the army to cross. Burnside picked Fredericksburg against Lincoln's wishes, but Lincoln picks crossing against Burnside's wishes. And that's what has to come to fruition on December 11th, 12th, and 13th. Now, December 11th, the Union Army is going to force its way across the river. This is one of the most unprecedented days in American military history, at least in the 19th century. I think December 11th requires a lot more study than it has gotten. It is often eclipsed by the tremendous bloodletting of December 13th, which is largely arcane in our world. But December 11th is still very relevant because it is the almost unprecedented. Union engineers attempted to lay down bridges at several points on the Rappahannock, the north end of the city, the south end of the city, and about 1.5 miles below the city. They were hoping with speed and surprise to catch the Confederates spread out along the river for 10 miles above and 20 miles below Fredericksburg. So if they could quickly mass forces on the Confederate side and punch a hole through, conceivably, they can make the entire Confederate defense of the Rappahannock Valley null and void, and perhaps even isolate part of it and destroy it in detail. But December 11th didn't work that way. It starts with a maverick officer from Mississippi, a non-professional, whoops, getting ahead of myself, a non-professional named William Barksdale, who had a brigade of troops sent to guard the riverfront at Fredericksburg. Instead of relying on conventional wisdom of keeping his troops together and functioning as a unit, he did an unconventional thing and broke them up into small cells and cadres and had them fight as individuals, as sharpshooters or snipers in among the houses and the alleyways. He was able to stop the engineers dead by targeting engineers and their officers. The bridges couldn't be finished. The troops couldn't get across. They couldn't punch through Robert E. Lee's defenses. Barksdale only had 2 jobs this day. 1, detect a crossing in a timely way and alert Robert E. Lee so that he could start to marshal his forces. 2, delay that crossing as long as possible to allow Lee to start that concentration. He was able to alert Robert E. Lee by 5 a.m. of the crossing, and he was able to hold them at bay for almost another 11 hours along the river. Leads to other unconventional answers. The Union Army bombarded the city of Fredericksburg trying to drive Barksdale's men out. They massed 183 cannon. They sent over 3,000 rounds into the city. At one point, artillerists counted 100 bursts a minute over the town. Whole blocks went up in flames. Houses collapsed wholesale. But the Confederates clung to the rubble, and if anything, became even more impregnable. Fredericksburg becomes the first city that the Army has targeted for a bombardment during an active fluid battle as opposed to a siege, where it becomes part of the target, becomes part of that battlefield. In this case, it didn't work, which leads us to another unprecedented movement. Union infantry were placed in pontoon boats and ferried across under fire to establish a bridgehead to drive the Confederates physically out. This is the first riverine crossing under fire in American military history. It's the first beachhead established under fire in our history. The great-great-granddaddy of D-Day and Incheon and the South Pacific is played out in the currents of the Rappahannock. But there's not a single person here who's ever even thought of doing such a thing before December 11th, read about such a thing, practiced such a thing, or was prepared for such a thing. They were making it up as they went along. Now, operationally, if you're Burnside, that's a disturbing trend. Step one out of the box, make stuff up. But if you're looking at tactically, from the people who get into the boats, they're innovative, they're creative, they're adaptive, they're exploitive, and they're successful, which is impressive. Which leads to another unprecedented moment. The Confederates continued to defy them. Barksdale sees a way to retard their advance and embarrass them more. He fights house by house, block by block through the downtown area of Fredericksburg. This is the first urban combat in North America. Again, nobody knew what they were doing. The Federals particularly, because they had walked into something that they were unprepared for. What is impressive is General Barksdale's men gave up the first street along the river, Sophia Street, and fell back to prepared positions on Caroline Street. When they lost those positions, they fell back to prepared positions on Princess Anne Street. They anticipated this. They had built a defense in depth prior to ever even using this, and it worked effectively. They held up the Federal advance dramatically. By 7 p.m., the Union operation is 12 hours behind schedule. They were supposed to have been on top of the Confederate line at Marie's Heights at 7 a.m. 7 p.m., they had made an incursion of all of 2 blocks into the city of Fredericksburg and completely destroyed Burnside's plans. The street fighting particularly was nasty. The 20th Massachusetts Regiment, known as the Harvard Regiment because they had so many alums among their officers, went into one intersection with about 307 personnel. They lost 157 of them in the intersection. Half the regiment wiped out. They said it was the worst combat they had ever been in their entire existence, which is amazing when you consider that in 48 hours they're going to attack the notorious stone wall at Marie's Heights. They're going to defend the stone wall at Gettysburg against Pickett's charge at the Copse of Trees, and they're going to fight at the Bloody Angle at Spotsylvania in hand-to-hand combat that exceeds 22 hours of uninterrupted duration. But this is their one moment that they talk about being worse than all of them. They were in an intersection for just a couple of minutes. Because of that experience, we have another unprecedented moment. The Union Army was angry, they were bitter, they wanted revenge. They couldn't take it on the Confederates because they had slipped back into even better positions. And so they took it out on the city. They ransacked Fredericksburg from top to bottom. One person said that they were worse than the hungriest of Huns and the most Gothic of Goths. Fredericksburg becomes the first American city ransacked since the British burned Washington. And it's the first American city ransacked by Americans. So December 11th is a dramatic day. It talks about the difficulties of breaking into cities and securing them and maintaining security while you're in them. So December 11th is probably a good day for the modern military establishment to study as opposed to December 13th, because a lot of this is still very relevant. They were fighting a 20th and 21st century battle that day without any rules. Which brings us to December 13th. Burnside crossed with the idea of speed and surprise, trying to secure a toehold before the Confederates could concentrate. Barksdale's Confederates on the riverfront destroyed that. They not only delayed Burnside through December 11th, made it sure that he wasn't even able to marshal his strength on December 12th. December 13th would be the day that the Union Army is up in full strength, but so are the Confederates. from this point on out, it's not about speed or surprise. It is about brawn. It is not about guile. It's about punching through there using your strength. Looking at this position, the Federal Army was able to marshal about 35 to 40,000 troops in the city itself and another 60,000 below the city in the floodplain. The Confederates were able to hem them in using a series of ridges outside